Good evening, everybody. Welcome to History Author Talks. It's so great to see everybody again. I thank you for joining us on this Tuesday evening, or West Coast Tuesday afternoon, as it were. And I'm pleased to have so many of my regulars back. I am very happy about tonight's program, which will begin in a few minutes. As we have launched the new year, I have already been in conversation with a number of my public history partners, and we've started to plan our 10 Crucial Days tours for 2023. We have one coming up in April, one coming up in May. Then we're talking about doing some exciting programming in June and July. In July, we have at Washington Crossing Historic Park our Rebels and Redcoats automobile show, which is always a lot of fun, where we put British and German cars on one side of the field, and we have American and French cars on the other side of the field, and we compete to see who has the best cars on the field. So that's a lot of fun at Washington Crossing Historic Park. We're going to do that July 4th weekend, and we're going to be playing some of our music from from The Crossing, the revolutionary new musical, which I'm also a part of. So that's going to be both at Washington Crossing Park and at Princeton Battlefield. So you'll have to stay tuned and take a look at 10crucialdays.org and see what we're doing there. I want to remind everybody that the books from our author tonight are available at the History Author Talks bookshop. If you just go to historyauthortalks.com and you look at the tab that says bookshop, you'll be able to see all of the books from our guest tonight. You will also be able to see all of our past programs. We record all of these programs as we are recording tonight's program, and you will be able to see any of our past programs that you may have missed. And of course, you'll be able to purchase the books from our earlier guests. Portion of the proceeds are donated to the Sons of the American Revolution Museum library at our headquarters in Louisville, Kentucky. And there's some great resources at SAR.org, educational resources. If you want to take a look at education.sar.org, you'll see some terrific resources there. So with that, I am pleased now to introduce you to tonight's guest. As we all know, as you know, we mostly do Revolutionary War. Well, tonight's program is really we're doing some time travel here and going into the modern era of the antebellum period to find out what happened after the American Revolution. And I am pleased that having not only known tonight's guest for a number of years, he is also, full disclosure, he is also my client. I am his literary agent, and I'm just thrilled with the work that he has done on this book. Tonight's book is called Indivisible. Indivisible is about Daniel Webster and the birth of American nationalism. Joel Paul is our author. Joel is a professor of constitutional and international law at the University of California, Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. And he is the author of Without Precedent, Chief Justice Marshall and His Times, and his first book, which was called Unlikely Allies: How a Merchant, a Playwright, and a Spy Saved the American Revolution, which I wholeheartedly recommend. It's just terrific. Joel takes difficult subjects and writes a wonderful narrative. He lives in Northern California, and with that, I'd like to introduce you all to my author and my friend, Joel Paul. So let's bring him in here. There we go. Joel, welcome to History Author Talks this evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Great. That's terrific. Well, so Joel, before we get into talking about Indivisible, let's talk about your earlier books just for a few minutes. Unlikely Allies, How a Merchant, a Playwright, and a Spy Saved the American Revolution. For our audience who are unfamiliar with the book, just give us the elevator pitch. What's this about?
Sure. It's a wild, completely improbable story about a man, Silas Deane, who was a shopkeeper in Wethersfield, Connecticut, who had never left Connecticut in his life, couldn't speak a word of French, didn't know anything about international diplomacy. And in 1775, Ben Franklin decides he's the perfect guy to send on a secret mission to persuade Louis XVI to arm the Americans against the British and win the American Revolution. And the reason Franklin thinks he's the perfect guy for the job is because Franklin says he's so improbable, the British will never suspect him. And the book is about how he succeeds with the help of two other men. The French comic playwright Caron de Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais is the man who wrote The Marriage of Figaro and The Barber of Seville, the original plays. He's also the inventor of the wristwatch. When he was age 19, he built the Paris water system with the Perrier brothers. He designed the modern harp. He was a famous musician. And on the side, he was an arms dealer. And he and Silas Deane get together and plan this operation to smuggle all of the arms, the ammunition, the uniforms for an army of 30,000 men. And they get all of that to Washington's army in Saratoga in time for the Battle of Saratoga, which many of you know was the turning point of the war in the Northeast. But the critical person was the third man, the Chevalier d'Eon, who was the French ambassador to London. He was a great war hero in the French army. He was also a spy working for Louis XV, Louis XIV rather. But what made him especially interesting is he was a woman who had pretended to be a man for 40 years. And as a man had rose to power as a general and a spy and a diplomat until she meets Beaumarchais and falls in love with him. And her decision to come out as a woman and marry Beaumarchais provides the catalyst that persuades Louis XVI to arm the Americans against the British and win the American Revolution. And it is entirely a true story that I just happened upon through a series of coincidences.
So, you know, we all learn in our textbooks how it was Ben Franklin who was the great hero who helped us bring the French in. Well, Ben Franklin closed the deal, but it was this Joel's story in Unlikely Allies that is really the backstory, or as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, that anyone who is interested in the American Revolution must read Unlikely Allies. It's a terrific read. Sounds bizarre. And then you moved on to John Marshall and to Chief Justice John Marshall. And I have to admit, as your literary agent, when you first said this, I thought, oh gosh, what a snoozer. But you took a very, very difficult subject and really explained a lot of the structure that we're dealing with today with Chief Justice John Marshall and how he really created the Supreme Court and the power of the Supreme Court. What do you think was important? What was the most important aspect of Chief Justice John Marshall?
Well, John Marshall was at the center of all of the political history of this country for the first 50 years or so. He was not just the fourth Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was also the Secretary of State, the guy who actually supervised the construction of Washington, D.C. He was the guy who stood up to Monsieur Talleyrand when the French were interfering with American ships before the quasi-war with France in 1798. He was also a soldier who had distinguished himself in the American Revolution at Valley Forge. Washington was so impressed with him that he appointed the 19-year-old as the Judge Advocate General of the Army at Valley Forge, long before Marshall had ever thought about going to law school. So he's a really important figure in the whole political history of the time. And of course, as Chief Justice, he set out the basic construct for our Constitution. Before John Marshall, the Supreme Court was not really a co-equal branch of our government. It was really sort of a kind of afterthought by the framers. The designers of Washington had forgotten to build a courthouse for the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to meet in the basement of the Capitol building because they had no courthouse of their own. But John Marshall's the guy who really elevated the court and made it a co-equal branch of the government. And that's what my book is about, how he did that.
Well, so after John Marshall, I remember when you called me up one day and you said, I want to do a book about Daniel Webster and the Caroline incident. Now, I don't know if we'll get to the Caroline incident in this book or in tonight's program, but the Caroline incident became one chapter in a much more expansive look at Daniel Webster. And we're going to talk about Daniel Webster tonight, but more importantly, we're going to talk about the subtitle, the other part of the subtitle, The Birth of American Nationalism, which has so much relevance to what's going on today. And so let's sort of start at the beginning here and see how far we can get through. I want to remind everybody that you are certainly welcome to ask questions. You please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen if you have questions as we move along here. But I wanted to start off with this. And the first framing of our national government was with the Articles of Confederation, which took effect even before the end of the Revolution. Explain how we transformed or really morphed from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, and how that set the stage for state or regional nationalism.
Sure. So as many of you know, at the end of the American Revolution, there was an enormous war debt. And one of the big problems that the country faced was that states really didn't have the means to sort of pay off this war debt. It was also the problem that under the Treaty of Paris, we had promised that U.S. troops that British troops would withdraw from the United States. But in exchange, we promised the British that we would enforce the debts owed to British creditors. Well, the state courts were not willing to do that. So state courts in Virginia routinely refused to pay back the British debtors, and we owed a huge amount of money to British debtors at the time. So the British simply refused to withdraw their troops. And so people don't realize it, but British troops remained in occupation in the northern reaches of our country long after the Treaty of Paris. And there was the further problem that each of the states under the Articles of Confederation were really free to conduct their own foreign relations and to have their own trade policies. And they imposed tariffs on goods that would move between state borders. So basically, if you were shipping tobacco from South Carolina up to New York, by the time it got to New York, it was so expensive that nobody wanted it. And this created all kinds of economic dislocations, along with the fact that you didn't have a national bank or national currency. And so the Confederation Congress decided to get together and come up with ideas for amending the Articles of Confederation. What we think of today as the Constitutional Convention wasn't the Constitutional Convention. It was simply a convention to talk about how to amend the articles. But James Madison, young man, shows up with a copy of a draft constitution in his back pocket and suggests that we forget about the Articles of Confederation and try a new form of government. Well, the fact is that in a sense, our Constitution was unconstitutional from the start because we never had the authority for these guys to get together in Philadelphia and come up with a draft constitution, but they did. And they created their own method, ignoring the Confederation Congress. They created their own method for ratifying that document and turning it into our Constitution.
So in your introduction, you segment nationalism into different and sometimes intersecting spheres. Explain the difference between material and continental and populist, constitutional and cultural nationalism. You have all these different types of nationalism, which I found fascinating.
So basically, after the Constitution was written, America was a kind of concept, but it wasn't a reality for most Americans. John Rutledge, one of the justices in the Supreme Court, famously wrote once that the framers got together to form a customs union, and they founded a nation by accident. And that is, in fact, what happened. People in Virginia didn't feel any particular loyalty to people in New York. They were Virginians. They weren't New Yorkers. People in Pennsylvania didn't think of themselves as being Americans either. So what you had was really something more like what the European community looked like in its early days. There were then different competing ideas about what it meant to be an American. The French writer Crèvecoeur famously asked the question, what is an American? And it was a reasonable question to ask at the time. Henry Clay had the idea that America was really a kind of economic union, and that as we formed infrastructure, as we created bridges and roads and canals, the country would kind of become knit together. And that kind of material nationalism was one way of thinking about the country. A different way of thinking about the country, John Quincy Adams imagined that we were somehow had this God-given right to occupy the whole continent from ocean to ocean. And he believed that the territory itself defined who we were as Americans. A lot of the writers at the time, like Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, kind of also had this idea that American culture needed to distinguish itself from British culture, and that the distinguishing feature of American life was our territory. It was the resources, the rivers, the forests, the mountains of our land that made us Americans. And then you have, of course, John C. Calhoun, who comes along and says, no, we're not really Americans. The Constitution is just a compact of states, and really we're South Carolinians, we're Floridians, we're not Americans, and that each of the states had voluntarily joined this Constitution and had the right, therefore, to nullify federal law and withdraw from the Constitution at will. And then Andrew Jackson comes along, and Andrew Jackson has this idea that what defines us as Americans is our race, that Americans are inherently white Europeans. And his idea of racial populism captures people's imagination. When we think today about America being a white Christian nation, that kind of has its origins from the thinking of Andrew Jackson. And against that kind of racist populism, Daniel Webster comes up with another formulation, which is constitutional nationalism. Webster says the Constitution is the organic expression of the will of all Americans, and that as such, the Constitution made us all Americans. It doesn't matter what our faith was. It doesn't matter where we came from, what our race is. We are all Americans, made so by the Constitution. And that idea captures people's imagination because of the strength of Webster's eloquence and his famed oratory. And that's, he's sort of the hero of my book, which is about really more than Daniel Webster. It's not really a biography of Daniel Webster. It's really more about these different competing ideas of nationalism and how Webster ultimately triumphs.
And this is evident throughout the book. I mean, in every chapter, you talk about, excuse me, the elements and the characters and the competing interests, regional interests, political interests of each of these different forms of nationalism as a great umbrella, but how it really leads us into Civil War and beyond. Just as almost a sidebar, explain the difference between patriotism and nationalism.
Sure. So, when we think about patriotism, what we really mean by patriotism is our commitment to the country, our commitment to defend the country, to support the country, to make sacrifices for our country. Nationalism, I think, is more about kind of how we define ourselves and how we define all Americans. What relationship, what affinity we feel for other people in the United States. We feel a certain affinity for people in other states because we define ourselves, all of us, as Americans, and we do so because of Daniel Webster.
So at the founding era, or I should say the revolutionary era, we managed to somehow pull ourselves together under the commander-in-chief, and there were these series of battles both on land and at sea where we all fought together. We fought regionally, but we fought for what Joseph Ellis refers to as the cause, and what was referred to then as the cause. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but let's talk a little bit more about what it meant to be an American at the beginning of the Republic. I mean, there was an American army, but there were regiments from all these different states. What was the psyche of the typical American about the United States during the Revolution and immediately afterwards?
Well, people, I think, the way to think about the American Revolution, I think, is more like the way we think about our involvement in World War I and World War II. Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, we were allies. We were allies in a common struggle for independence from Great Britain. There was not an idea at the time that the United States as such was really united. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that the lie in the Declaration of Independence were the words United States of America. We weren't United States. We were allied states of America. And we remained so throughout the period of the Articles of Confederation. We couldn't really negotiate treaties with foreign powers. The Confederation Congress couldn't tax. They had to just ask the states for voluntary contributions. The Articles of Confederation didn't have an army. People were afraid of a standing army in any case. But the states had militias, and the states each had their own foreign policies, as I said. So really, they were separate nations almost. And the only thing that you could say united us was the common experience of being allies in the American Revolution, which, in many ways, people have described the American Revolution as a civil war. And in many ways, it was a civil war in which the Loyalists fought against the rebels. And so it was not really a war of the United States. It was a war of allied states. And it really wasn't until really the period for the Jacksonian era, 1820s, 30s, 40s, that Americans really begin to crystallize this notion of a national identity as American.
So in chapters 1 and 2, you present a snapshot of Independence Day, 1801, and then chapter 2, Independence Day, 1861, sort of bookends of the beginning and then the sort of end of your thesis, if you will.
And in chapter is July 4th, 1812.
Exactly. So, but what I'm going to do, I need to read something here, which I just found so searing. At the end of chapter 2, you write, what explains the burst of nationalism that motivated young men to risk their lives in the defense of the Union? These men did not fight and die as Massachusetts men or New Yorkers. They fought as Americans to defend the Union. They went to their deaths believing in a very different country than the country of Thomas Jefferson. Clearly, something had shifted in the country's psyche since the time of Jefferson. The phrase that echoed in their heads, they had learned to recite in school. Boys, learn liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable. These were not the words of Lincoln. These were the words of an American statesman who sacrificed his political ambition for the cause of the Union. So we had the cause of the Revolution, now in 1861, the cause of the Union, and that man was Daniel Webster. So let's talk about this fellow. So we've heard of him. Some people get him confused with Noah Webster's dictionary. I'm sure but he was in public service from 1813 to 1852. That's 39 years. So who is Daniel Webster, and what was his influence on the national psyche in the antebellum era? That's a big question, I know, but let's talk about who is this guy?
One of the things that's so remarkable is that most Americans today, even well-educated Americans today, really are not at all familiar with Daniel Webster. Maybe they've read the short story, The Devil and Daniel Webster by Stephen Vincent Benet, but Daniel Webster was the single most famous person in the first half of the 19th century. I mean, he was famous not just in the United States, he was famous all over the world. Daniel Webster was both a congressman and a senator from New Hampshire and then later Massachusetts. He was twice Secretary of State. He was a frequent candidate for president, never successfully. But most importantly, Daniel Webster was known throughout the world as the single greatest orator of the English language. And that may be hard for people to believe, but Daniel Webster had this remarkable capacity. He could stand up before an audience of tens of thousands of people and project his voice. And he could speak on his feet for 4 to 6 hours extemporaneously, no notes, and be absolutely riveting. People describe the experience of sitting through one of Daniel Webster's lectures as mesmerizing. They would walk out dazed, transformed by it. And people didn't mind the length of how long he spoke. His speeches would be transcribed by people in the audience and republished in newspapers all over the United States and published in pamphlet form. Everybody in America was familiar with Daniel Webster. If Daniel Webster walked down the street, his image was so famous, he would be recognized. The President of the United States could walk out of the White House and not be recognized in Washington, D.C. in the 19th century, because Daniel Webster had that kind of charismatic, larger than life appearance and reputation. When Daniel Webster went to Britain on vacation, on sabbatical, he was literally mobbed by every famous political figure, literary figure, royalty in the country. Queen Victoria had him to dinner twice, which was unusual. And not to be outdone, King Louis Philippe of France insisted that he come to France to have dinner with Louis. And Louis then had a gigantic 30-foot by 16-foot painting done of Daniel Webster giving his most famous speech before the Senate, which now hangs in Faneuil Hall in Boston. And it's also a small excerpt of which is on the cover of my book, another reason to buy my book. Thank you, Roger. So it is literally the case that Webster was probably the most famous man alive in his time. And we think of Lincoln as a great orator, but the fact is Lincoln was nobody. He was vastly overshadowed by Webster until long after Webster's death. Lincoln doesn't really emerge as a national figure until around 1857 with the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case. But before that, Lincoln was a nobody. He was a one-term congressman whose idol was Daniel Webster. And many of the things we think of as the most famous quotes from Lincoln were actually Daniel Webster's words. When Lincoln says, we're a government of the people, by the people, for the people, he didn't have to say to his audience, oh, I'm quoting Daniel Webster now, because everyone in his audience knew those were Daniel Webster's words. And they knew it because they had read it in school. Every school in America from the 1840s on, right up to the early part of the 20th century, had readers that were published by either McGuffey or Pierpont. These readers, there were as many as 50 million of these readers by 1850 in the United States, in a population of around 30 million. So every educated person in America had read these readers, and the readers attempted to create national identity and national union by copying the words of Daniel Webster. And so students would be required to memorize and stand up and recite the words of Daniel Webster from his most famous speeches. That was the kind of influence that Daniel Webster had.
So you've just described the public persona of a man who most Americans don't know really anything about. He was a man of his times. What was the man like? I mean, where was he educated? What did other people think of him? How did he dress? What was this guy like?
So Daniel Webster, he was the youngest of 10 children. His father was a not very well-off farmer in New Hampshire. Webster's father saw Daniel Webster had a talent for reading and decided that he would take a mortgage on his home to send Webster to school. So he sends Webster to Phillips Academy in New Hampshire. And Webster gets there, and his first year in school, he is expected to memorize and recite. And he stands up to recite, and he's so terrified by the experience of standing up and reciting in public, he can't speak. And he's completely humiliated. And he leaves Phillips Academy. He goes home dejected, humiliated. This is a terrible thing after all the sacrifices his father has made. And he's determined as a young boy that he is going to master the art of public speaking. And that's exactly what he does. And a few years later, he's sent to Dartmouth College on a scholarship, and he becomes an outstanding public speaker at Dartmouth. He wins all sorts of awards and things like that. And so very early on, he shows this remarkable talent for public speaking. And because of this remarkable voice he had, people describe it as sounding like a church organ. And physically, he was very imposing. He had an unusually large head. He looked a little bit like a puppet. He had this huge head. He was not especially tall. He was maybe tall for the time, maybe 5'9", but not as tall as Lincoln, for example. But his features were so large and imposing, and he was unusually had an unusually dark complexion and dark eyes and dark hair and a large forehead. And he was sometimes called Black Dan because of his darkness. But he was also later known as Godlike Dan. And he was Godlike Dan because of this remarkable speaking capacity. As godlike as he was in terms of his speaking capacity, he was not so godlike in his personal life. He had an excessive fondness for women, wine, and money. And he had a bad reputation for various scandalous affairs. He also, later in life, much later in life, drank to excess and ultimately died from excessive drinking, most likely. And probably most disconcerting, he lived extravagantly. Maybe the experience of growing up poor, he wanted to overcome that, and he had just lavish homes. He had a huge farm that he purchased in Marshfield, Massachusetts, with something like 100 buildings he built on the property. He had his own lake, and he stocked it with all kinds of animals. He had lots of employees. He couldn't actually afford that, apart from the fact that he was a frequent attorney before the Supreme Court and argued many of the most important cases before the Supreme Court. So he made a lot of money that way, but he also married. His second wife was very wealthy. But he relied a lot on money from his constituents. And so as Massachusetts began to industrialize, some of the wealthy industrialists that some of you may have heard of actually gave him large amounts of money, which would have been okay, except he also then voted in Congress in ways in their favor, which he might have done anyway, because after all, protective tariffs were popular in New England. But it was disconcerting that he was so dependent on other people's money.
You mean politicians paid him off? That never happens. All right, so with every great man, I suppose, in public service, something comes along that propels them into that public service and where they start to make their mark. Explain how we went to war in 1812 and the Hartford Convention and subsequent brief good era of good feeling, and which you explain in the next few chapters of the book are anything but an era of good feeling. But let's get into the meat of how Daniel Webster became Daniel Webster.
Yeah, so as in many of you know, President Madison is persuaded to go to war against Britain for a second time. The War of 1812 is sometimes framed, it's sort of, I should say, historians struggle with trying to explain the War of 1812 because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's true that the British were interfering with American shipping on the high seas, but the French were doing it also. And in fact, the French were seizing more ships than the British were at the time. But the British also were impressing some sailors on American ships into the British Navy. Now, under British law, it was common to impress men into the British Navy. They had the right to do so for British subjects, and they contended that these men were actually British subjects who were simply posing as Americans on American ships. And frankly, the evidence is mixed as to whether that is, how many of those people were actually American citizens as opposed to British citizens. But probably the real reason for the war, the reason that Henry Clay, for example, and the other war hawks pushed Madison into committing to this war, was because they really thought that Canada should properly belong to the United States. And it was a war of aggression to attempt to seize Canadian territory. And we got whooped badly trying to seize Canadian territory. Webster, Webster, Webster was a young attorney in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at the time, and he gave a speech opposing the war. And it really got people riled up, because even though the Republicans, I'm talking now about the Jeffersonian Republicans, even though the Republicans were arguing that the war was to protect American shipping, the American shipping industry didn't want anything to do with the war because it was interfering with American shipping. They had imposed all sorts of restrictions on American shipping that the American shippers did not want to have. So the war was actually a war that had impoverished New England and hurt large centers of shipping like Portsmouth and Boston. So he gives this speech and he is instantly swept into Congress. I mean, people just decide this is the man we want to send to Congress to represent us. So he gets elected to Congress as the anti-war candidate. That's sort of the original basis for Webster's involvement in politics. Later, Webster moves to Boston and he joins a Boston firm and Boston practice, and he's quite successful as an attorney. And he is again asked to give a speech on the anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. And he gives the speech at Plymouth at which he condemns, and at this point he's been elected to Congress as a senator, as a congressman from Boston. He gives a speech in which he condemns his Bostonian constituents for having unclean hands in their involvement in the slave trade. And he basically says that the nation of the Pilgrims is polluted by the slave trade, and that it is unworthy for the descendants of the Pilgrims to engage in slavery or to profit from slavery in any way. How were they profiting from slavery? Well, the cotton that was picked in the South was coming up to the North, the ships that were carrying slaves, the ships that were carrying tobacco. The North profited in various ways from the products of slave labor. And Webster's speech makes him one of the most outspoken opponents of slavery in the Northeast. And he becomes sort of known as the voice of New England or the conscience of New England after that.
So one of the things that I love about your writing, Joel, is that you have such an expansive view of what's going on in this time. We talked earlier about these different spheres of nationalism, constitutional and continental and material. In chapter 7, you analyzed American literary revolution from Britain, and this was the cultural nationalism, which you mentioned earlier. You explained that the iconic authors did little actually to spur a national sense of identity. This isn't really a question, it's more of an observation, but I thought it curious that none of the authors that you mentioned, Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, Fenimore Cooper, and there were some others, they were all Northerners. Do you think it prompted me to look for great storytellers from the early Republic from the South, while so much of the belles lettres come, as well as the roots of our rich musical heritage, come from the South. In the early 19th century, there was precious little, the 18th century literature, Southern literature in the 18th century. In your research, might there be a reason why cultural nationalism was not really fermented?
It's a really great question, Roger, and I'm struggling with that question. I've thought about it myself. I think here's one possible theory, and I don't know that this is the right theory, but it's the best I can come up with on the spot. The whole idea of cultural nationalism was a reaction against the culture of Britain. It was an attempt to try to distinguish, to show what was uniquely American about us. In the South, the whole idea of being a gentleman, of being well off, of having a comfortable life, of being well educated, was sort of to kind of basically model the life of the British aristocracy. So you lived like a British aristocrat. The last thing Southern Americans wanted was to try to distinguish themselves from Britain. They were too closely involved with Britain. Planters would send their sons to school at Oxford and Cambridge and London. That's where they were educated. They would have high tea, and the whole sort of tea ceremony was a way of kind of reenacting the culture of Britain as they understood it. So even though they were proud to be Virginians or proud to be South Carolinians, they thought that the good life, the right life, was to sort of live like British people lived. And most of the literature in the country, right up until the 1850s, was dominated by British writers. Partly this was because of the copyright laws. We did not recognize the copyrights of British authors. So you could take Dickens' work and you could republish it in the United States, and you didn't have to pay him a dime. And so as long as the copyrights didn't protect Dickens and other great British authors, Americans continued to read British literature. And what Hawthorne and James Fenimore Cooper and Melville and Whitman all tried to do was to try to say something that was uniquely American, that would kind of help us to see ourselves as having a separate destiny from the British.
One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about that particular chapter that is sort of in the middle of the book is that it really helps paint the tapestry of what was becoming America at the time. And I sort of thank you for that intermission, if you will, as we were talking about everything that's going on with the sectionalism and the politics. And I thought that was fascinating. But now let's get back to the nitty-gritty here. Explain how John Quincy Adams and James Monroe's predilections towards expansionism moved the nation towards dealing with the issue of slavery, and how Webster played the role in what became known as the Missouri Compromise. And for those who do not know, the Missouri Compromise admitted Maine as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, together with the proviso that the rest of the Louisiana Purchase in any state north of parallel 3630 would be free. So tell us about the Monroe Doctrine, as it were.
Oh boy, okay.
I throw you the easy ones here.
That's a lot on my plate. So let me try to handle that. Monroe, of course, is a protege of Madison and Jefferson, as you made reference to earlier, his election was very popular. It was thought that after the tumultuous years of Madison's election, the burning of Washington, the tragic War of 1812, that Monroe would kind of calm the waters. And he was a very popular figure. He was not a particularly bright man. He wasn't a particularly deep fellow. He was a very well-intentioned person. He was more like Washington than Jefferson in that respect. He was a person with good character. His intellect wasn't what got him elected. And he chose John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State, because John Quincy Adams was the single most qualified man in America, as far as I can tell. He had served as ambassador to 4 or 5 different diplomatic posts in Britain, in Europe, rather. He was extremely well educated. He spoke several languages. He was incredibly thoughtful, in many ways, a very modern figure. John Quincy Adams had this idea of territorial nationalism. He had this idea that the whole country should belong to us, the whole nation, the whole continent should belong to us. And he really sort of fed this idea to Monroe. We often think about Jackson's role in the displacement of Native American tribes, but in a sense, John Quincy Adams also had a role to play here, because he sort of had this notion that, we should just dominate the continent. During the Monroe administration, we had trouble with some tribes in Florida, and without getting too deeply into the story, Jackson decides, initially Jackson is sent to just basically kind of restore order along the border with Spanish Florida. Florida at that time was a Spanish territory. But Jackson decides, what the hell, I may as well just take Florida. So Jackson, with no authority from anyone, decides to invade Florida. He takes over Florida, and he commits all sorts of war crimes, including murdering innocent civilians. And people in Washington are horrified. I mean, he murders innocent British civilians, risking another war with Britain. He creates circumstances where there could be a war with Spain or France. It's really a complete dereliction of his duty. And ironically, John Quincy Adams is the only member in the cabinet who defends Jackson. He defends Jackson in part because he likes this notion of occupying the whole of the continent. Spain cedes to the United States in a complicated negotiation with John Quincy Adams, not just Florida, but also other parts of the Spanish territory, right out to Louisiana, and also agrees that the United States territorial line should extend out to the Pacific. And it's only a line, but in acknowledging that line, there's basically a line between what was then a Spanish territory in California on the West Coast and British territory in the Pacific Northwest. They have kind of given John Quincy Adams an opportunity to stick his toe in the Pacific Ocean, because it's only a line, but it sets this idea in motion that we are a continental power. And then ultimately, he takes one further step when he writes what we now think of as the Monroe Doctrine. He gives a speech himself where he says basically that the United States should be the protector of the whole hemisphere. And then he gets the president to agree to insert that into his State of the Union message. And so the Monroe Doctrine is really the John Quincy Adams doctrine.
So I only have time for one more question, and this is one that you also talk about. I forget which chapter, but tell us how the 1824-1825 return visit from the Marquis de Lafayette furthered the cause of nationalism.
I'm sorry, I missed part of that, Roger.
Okay, tell us how the 1824-25 visit of Marquis de Lafayette furthered the cause of nationalism.
Yeah, okay, great, sure. So Lafayette, as many of you know, comes back to the United States on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Lafayette is kind of a touchstone. He is seen as the spiritual son of George Washington. And he arrives in America and receives a reception that is unprecedented. Even Washington himself had never seen crowds like this assemble. And Lafayette does something that no president had ever done, which is to tour all of the states. He travels up the coast, and the triumphant moment for him is the dedication of the memorial at Bunker Hill. Now, Lafayette's visit was invited by Monroe because it was an opportunity to try to, again, pull the country together, to kind of cement the country, to remind Americans of the greatness of our founding fathers and of the importance of the American Revolution. And it's Webster who was chosen to give the dedication speech at Bunker Hill, not Lafayette. Webster addresses a crowd of 40,000 people on an open hillside at Bunker Hill. And they had erected a temporary seating area for the ladies under a large tent. And Webster gets up to speak. The crowd is so excited to hear what Webster has to say that the people in the back start pushing forward, and the crowd topples the stand where the ladies are sitting, and the tent falls down on top of them, and there's absolute chaos. People are running in all directions. People are injured. Women are engulfed in this large tent. They can't get up. And the sitting marshal turns to Webster and says, "Well, it's impossible now. We have to conclude the ceremony." And Webster says, "No, nothing is impossible." And he turns to the crowd in this booming, booming voice. And I know this sounds apocryphal, but it is reported by several different newspapers at the time. He stands up and he shouts out, "Be silent." And the entire crowd stops. And people sit down, they pull the tent off, and the proceedings resume. And Webster goes on to speak for several hours in the hot sun. That event was sort of part of the myth of godlike Daniel.
So what's Webster's legacy?
Webster's important legacy, I think, is that Webster is the guy whose idea of American nationality, whose idea that the Constitution is what knit us together, held this country together throughout our history, up until the present moment. Today, we hear a lot of things about nationalism, about ultranationalism, that sounds quite toxic. Webster pushed back against that kind of toxic nationalism in the time of Andrew Jackson. And he triumphed because he appealed to the American public's better angels. And I think what he had to say to us then, that liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable, that those words are as important, maybe more important today than they were when he spoke them.
Well, we got nowheres near even the middle of the book. Everyone else, you got to go read the book. Where the hour is up, and if you didn't learn something tonight, then you weren't listening. Joel, that was just terrific. I appreciate it. I hope everyone else did. I want to certainly thank you for your time. I want to remind everyone that you can go to historyauthortalks.com and look at the bookshop, and you can purchase Indivisible or any of Joel's books there, or you can go to Joel's website, joelrichardpaul.com. Or wherever you buy books, your local bookseller, online, wherever you buy books. And this is one you really need to not just have on your bookshelf, but you need to read. It's so relevant, and Joel does such a great job. So I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Indivisible. As always, I always tell everyone, I wouldn't mind getting donations for 10crucialdays.org to help me with my public history work. Our next program is not going to be until February 7th. We're going to have Edward Larson. Edward Larson's new book is American Inheritance, Liberty, and Slavery in the Birth of the Nation, 1765 to 1795. Larson is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And I'm sure that this promises to be another terrific conversation, as tonight's was with Joel. So I remind everyone to support your local historic sites, and I thank you all for joining us this evening. And I wish you all the very best. Joel, I'm sure I'll be talking to you soon. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.